A woman lost her life during a federal immigration operation in Minneapolis, and the story behind what happened is far more complex than the first headline suggested. What unfolded on a quiet residential street wasn't just a single moment, but a chain of decisions, conflicting accounts, and unanswered questions that now sit at the center of a national debate. Today, we're breaking down what is publicly known, what is disputed, and why this incident has triggered such intense reactions, not just in Minneapolis, but across the country. And one detail in the timeline changes how this entire situation is being viewed. The woman identified in this case was Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old resident of Minneapolis, originally from Colorado. According to public statements and social media posts that appear to belong to her, Renee described herself as a writer, a poet, a wife, and a mother, someone building a life while experiencing a new city. City officials emphasized that she was a member of the community, someone who, on that morning, was reportedly going about her day in her own neighborhood. This is important because understanding who she was outside of the incident helps frame why the response has been so emotional and why local leaders reacted so strongly. But to understand why this moment escalated, we need to look at where it happened and what was already happening in the city before that day. Because this incident didn't happen in isolation. It happened in a city already under pressure. The shooting occurred on a residential street in South Minneapolis, less than a mile from a location that holds deep historical and emotional weight for the city. At the time, federal immigration agents were conducting what officials described as targeted enforcement operations. According to the Department of Homeland Security, these operations were part of a broader federal initiative that had already increased tension between local officials and the federal government. Residents in the area had reportedly seen multiple federal vehicles operating in neighborhoods over recent weeks, contributing to heightened concern and anxiety within the community, and that context matters, because what happened next unfolded in a matter of moments. What exactly happened in those moments depends on who you ask. According to publicly available reporting, multiple videos from different vantage points were later shared on social media and reviewed by journalists. The footage shows several federal officers near an SUV stopped in the roadway. One officer can be heard demanding that the driver exit the vehicle, while another appears positioned near the front of the car. At one point, the vehicle reverses, then begins moving forward. Moments later, shots are fired into the vehicle by an officer positioned ahead of it. Shortly after, the SUV crashes nearby. Authorities have confirmed that Renee Good was fatally injured during this sequence. The key issue here isn't just what happened, but how those moments are interpreted. Because almost immediately, two very different explanations emerged. Federal officials stated that the officer involved believed the vehicle posed an immediate threat. According to a Department of Homeland Security spokesperson, the officer acted out of fear for personal safety, the safety of fellow officers, and the public. From this perspective, the vehicle was described as being used in a dangerous manner. However, local leaders and witnesses have publicly challenged that version of events. An eyewitness told local media that officers appeared to give conflicting commands, with one agent telling the driver to leave the area, while another ordered her to exit the vehicle as he reached for the door. That discrepancy is now central to the ongoing debate, and this is where the situation escalates far beyond a single incident. Minneapolis officials responded forcefully, questioning both the tactics used and the federal narrative. The city's mayor stated publicly that, after reviewing the footage himself, he strongly disagreed with the self-defense explanation offered by federal authorities. The police chief also expressed serious concern, noting that while law enforcement officers are sometimes placed in dangerous situations, most agencies train specifically to reduce the need for lethal outcomes, particularly in encounters involving vehicles. Meanwhile, state officials announced that multiple agencies would review the incident, including federal and state investigators, to determine whether policies were followed appropriately. But this story doesn't end with official statements. Because outside the press conferences, the reaction on the ground told another story entirely. As news spread, the atmosphere in South Minneapolis shifted quickly. Neighbors gathered near the scene, not to sensationalize what had happened, but to understand it. According to residents interviewed by local media, many people initially believed the presence of multiple federal vehicles signaled another immigration enforcement action. Some community members reportedly used whistles and verbal calls to draw attention, a practice that, according to residents, had become more common during recent enforcement operations as a way to alert neighbors. Several witnesses emphasized a shared concern. Fear and uncertainty had already been building in the area for weeks. From their perspective, this moment felt like a breaking point rather than an isolated incident. And that pressure didn't stay on the streets. It moved straight into city and state leadership. Within hours, the incident became a focal point of a much larger political conflict. Local officials accused federal agencies of operating without sufficient coordination or accountability, while federal representatives stood by their version of events. Statements from political leaders on both sides reflected sharply different interpretations of the same video evidence. Some described the shooting as a tragic but justified response to perceived danger. Others described it as reckless and unnecessary, arguing that it reflected a broader breakdown in trust between communities and federal enforcement. What made this especially volatile was timing. Minneapolis has long been a national symbol for conversations around policing, accountability, and public safety. Any use of force in the city now carries added weight and scrutiny. But scrutiny also means investigations, and those investigations are now underway. Officials confirmed that the incident is being reviewed by multiple agencies, including federal and state investigators. The purpose of these investigations is not only to determine what happened in those critical moments, but also whether established protocols were followed, and whether changes are necessary moving forward. Law enforcement experts note that shootings involving vehicles are among the most complex and controversial scenarios officers face. Many agencies train officers to reposition or disengage rather than fire, precisely because vehicles can create unpredictable outcomes. That's why several officials emphasize that this case may become a reference point for future policy decisions, regardless of the final conclusions. And yet beyond policy, there's another layer that keeps this story in the spotlight. This incident has quickly become part of a broader national discussion about immigration enforcement, local autonomy, and federal authority. In recent years, tensions between cities and federal agencies have intensified, particularly in communities that have publicly opposed aggressive enforcement tactics. Supporters of federal operations argue they are necessary for public safety and legal consistency. Critics argue that they create fear, confusion, and unintended consequence, especially when conducted in residential neighborhoods. The death of Renee Good has now become a symbol used by both sides to support very different arguments, and that raises the question many people are asking next. In the short term, officials have urged residents to remain calm and allow investigators to complete their work. City leaders have stressed the importance of peaceful responses, emphasizing that accountability comes through evidence, not escalation. At the same time, community organizers say the conversation cannot simply return to normal because for them, this incident reflects deeper, unresolved issues. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. And in Minneapolis, trust has been tested before. What makes this case stand out is not only the tragic outcome, but the number of systems it touches at the same time. Federal immigration enforcement, local public safety, community trust, political accountability. Each of these areas already carries tension on its own. When they collide in a single incident, the impact spreads far beyond one city block. Legal experts note that cases like this often become benchmarks, not because they are unique, but because they force institutions to clarify where authority begins, where it ends, and how responsibility is shared. In other words, this isn't just about what happened on one street. It's about how similar situations might be handled everywhere else, and that's why so many eyes are now on the outcome of these investigations. One of the most striking elements of this case is how quickly competing narratives formed. Federal officials emphasize officer safety and perceived threat. Local officials emphasize conflicting commands, tactical concerns, and community impact. Both sides point to video evidence, yet arrive at very different conclusions. This gap highlights a broader issue. Video can show what happened, but interpretation depends on training, policy, and perspective. That's why investigators will focus not only on the footage itself, but on procedures, communication, and decision-making leading up to the moment force was used. But beyond institutions, there is also a human cost that cannot be ignored. Renee Good left behind a child, family, and a community grappling with loss. City leaders and neighbors have emphasized remembering her as a person, not just as a name in a headline. Moments like this often become abstract when viewed only through political debate. But for those closest to the situation, the consequences are immediate and permanent. That reality is why officials on all sides have urged restraint, careful language, and respect as the investigation continues. And yet, even as this chapter closes, another question opens. The investigation will determine whether policies were followed and whether changes are required. But the deeper question may be harder to answer. How should federal enforcement operate inside local communities, especially in cities already shaped by past trauma and mistrust? That question doesn't have a simple resolution. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at how federal and local law enforcement responsibilities intersect, how similar cases have been handled in the past, and what lessons experts believe can be drawn moving forward. If you want a clearer understanding of how moments like this shape national policy and local reality, that's where we'll continue the conversation.